The early morning sun painted the Stanford campus in shades of gold, but Elizabeth Holmes had no time for scenery. While most students strolled to their classes, she sat in the corner of her dorm room, sketching out a future that would change medicine forever, or so she believed. At just 19 years old, Elizabeth was different. Driven, obsessive, she had been fascinated with science since childhood, inspired by her great-great-grandfather, a surgeon who had revolutionized medicine in his time. Now she saw herself as the next great innovator, someone who could eradicate pain, suffering, and the inefficiencies of modern healthcare. The idea came to her like a lightning bolt. What if a single drop of blood could reveal everything about a person's health? No more painful needles, no more waiting weeks for test results. A tiny drop, and you would know instantly. It was a vision so simple, so powerful, that it felt inevitable. But dreams, no matter how grand, required action. Elizabeth wasted no time. She filed a patent application for a wearable patch that could diagnose diseases in real time. Her professors were skeptical, cautioning that such a breakthrough required years of research. But Elizabeth wasn't interested in waiting. She had bigger plans. Stanford was merely a stepping stone. The classroom was too small for someone with ambitions of changing the world. One day she made a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. She dropped out. Armed with her idea, unshakable confidence, and an almost hypnotic ability to persuade, Elizabeth set out into Silicon Valley. She spoke with investors, scientists, and industry experts, selling them a vision so compelling that few dared to question it. And just like that, Theranos was born. Little did the world know, this was only the beginning of a journey filled with ambition, secrecy, and an empire built on promises. Silicon Valley had seen its fair share of visionaries, but none quite like Elizabeth Holmes. With her piercing blue eyes, black turtleneck sweaters reminiscent of Steve Jobs, and an unwavering belief in her mission, she was magnetic. Investors, doctors, and business leaders found themselves captivated by her vision. A world where disease could be detected early, where patients could take control of their own health, and where costly, painful blood tests would become obsolete. But vision alone wasn't enough. Elizabeth needed money, and she needed it fast. She worked tirelessly, pitching her revolutionary blood testing device, Edison, to the biggest names in venture capital. The device, she claimed, could run over 200 tests using just a single drop of blood. Traditional labs required vials of it, but Theranos promised speed, accuracy, and affordability in a sleek, compact machine that could fit in pharmacies and even homes. Skeptics raised concerns. Blood testing was notoriously complex. Tiny drops of blood could easily be contaminated or provide inconsistent results. But Elizabeth had mastered the art of persuasion. She spoke with conviction, her voice calm, deliberate, and unwavering. When questioned about the technology, she had a ready answer. This is the future. You're either with us or you're going to be left behind. It was the kind of statement that Silicon Valley thrived on. Investors didn't want to miss out on the next Apple or Google. With each pitch, Theranos' valuation soared. By 2014, Theranos was worth $9 billion. Elizabeth Holmes was celebrated as the world's youngest self-made female billionaire. With a net worth of $5 billion, her face graced the covers of Forbes, Fortune, and Time magazine. She was invited to speak at the most prestigious conferences, sitting alongside former U.S. presidents and business titans. She had assembled a powerful board of directors, including Henry Kissinger, George Shultz, and James Mattis, men whose influence stretched deep into politics, defense, and international affairs. Theranos had secured partnerships with major pharmacy chains like Walgreens and Safeway, promising to bring affordable, rapid blood testing to the masses. Stores across America began rolling out Theranos wellness centers. The revolution was no longer a dream, it was happening. But behind the dazzling headlines and billion-dollar deals, something was off. Scientists inside Theranos whispered doubts. Employees who asked too many questions were quickly silenced. The Edison machine, the supposed miracle device, remained shrouded in secrecy. Yet, Elizabeth kept pushing forward, brushing aside concerns. The world believed in her, investors, the media, even patients. After all, how could someone with so much power, so much brilliance, be wrong? At the gleaming headquarters of Theranos in Palo Alto, everything appeared perfect. The walls were adorned with motivational slogans. The laboratories were state-of-the-art. And Elizabeth Holmes walked the halls with an air of quiet authority. Employees whispered about her intensity. She rarely blinked. She worked longer hours than anyone, and she demanded absolute loyalty. But beneath the surface, the cracks were beginning to show. Inside the Theranos labs, scientists were growing uneasy. The Edison device, the machine that was supposed to revolutionize blood testing, was failing. Again and again, tests produced wildly inconsistent results. A single drop of blood simply wasn't enough to run hundreds of tests accurately. Some samples showed false positives for diseases, while others completely missed serious conditions. Every scientist at Theranos knew the truth: the technology didn't work. But speaking up wasn't an option. Elizabeth and her second-in-command, Ramesh Sunny Balwani, ruled with an iron grip. Employees who questioned the technology were fired. Others were watched closely, their emails monitored, their conversations overheard. Non-disclosure agreements were airtight. Anyone who spoke out would face lawsuits, financial ruin, and personal destruction. Yet, the world outside remained blissfully unaware. Elizabeth was still Silicon Valley's golden child. She dazzled audiences at tech conferences, spoke about her mission to democratize healthcare, and continued to secure millions in funding. Walgreens had already started rolling out Theranos testing centers across the country, trusting that the technology would deliver as promised. But inside those clinics, real patients were now relying on Theranos tests, and some of them were getting dangerous results. A woman was told she had HIV when she didn't. A man with diabetes received normal readings when his blood sugar was at a dangerous level. Cancer patients were misdiagnosed. Each mistake wasn't just a flaw in a product, it was a risk to human lives. At the Wall Street Journal, investigative reporter John Carreyrou had started hearing whispers. A former Theranos employee had reached out with concerns. The technology, they said, was a fraud. At first, it seemed unthinkable. How could a company worth billions, backed by some of the most powerful figures in America, be lying? But as Carreyrou dug deeper, he realized he was onto something much bigger than just another Silicon Valley failure. This wasn't just about a bad product. This was a house of cards, one that was about to come crashing down. Elizabeth Holmes had built a fortress of secrecy around Theranos. But cracks were widening, and the first real tremors of an impending collapse had begun. Inside Theranos labs, fear ruled. Employees who dared to question the Edison machine were met with swift retaliation. Whispers of doubt turned into silent resignations. Scientists who had once believed in the mission now saw the ugly truth. Theranos' tests were unreliable, its promises empty, and its leader unwilling to face reality. But outside the company's headquarters, someone was asking questions that couldn't be ignored. John Carreyrou, an investigative journalist at the Wall Street Journal, had received a tip. Theranos was a fraud. At first, it seemed too outrageous to believe. How could a $9 billion company, praised by world leaders, be a scam? But as Carreyrou started digging, he uncovered a disturbing pattern. Theranos was not using its own technology for most of its tests. The Edison machine, the revolutionary device that supposedly needed just a single drop of blood, was malfunctioning. To avoid detection, Theranos was secretly using commercial lab machines from other companies to process blood samples. The results were often inaccurate, but Elizabeth and her team continued to sell the illusion that Theranos' technology was infallible. When Carreyrou reached out to former employees, they were terrified. They had signed aggressive non-disclosure agreements. Theranos' lawyers, led by David Boies, one of the most feared attorneys in the country, had already crushed whistleblowers before. Speaking out meant risking everything. But one former employee, Tyler Schultz, the grandson of former Secretary of State George Shultz and a Theranos insider, couldn't stay silent. He had seen the company's inner workings firsthand. He knew that patients were being misled, and he knew that the technology simply did not work. Slowly, more sources began to talk. As Carreyrou pieced together the puzzle, Elizabeth Holmes fought back. Theranos' legal team, backed by its billions, tried to intimidate journalists and whistleblowers into silence. Employees were followed, their emails monitored, their every move scrutinized. Elizabeth personally called high-ranking officials, leveraging her connections to shut down the growing storm. But this time, the truth was too big to contain. In October 2015, the Wall Street Journal published the expose that would change everything. The article revealed the deception. Theranos machines didn't work. The company had misled investors, patients, and regulators. The blood tests were dangerously inaccurate. Almost overnight, the myth of Theranos began to crumble. Walgreens and Safeway, once eager partners, distanced themselves. Federal regulators launched investigations. The Securities and Exchange Commission, SEC, began looking into fraud charges. But Elizabeth Holmes didn't blink. She stood firm, appearing on television, denying every allegation. In interviews, she insisted that Theranos was under attack by those who feared change. She called it a war on innovation. Her confidence remained unshaken. But for the first time, the world was no longer listening. The Wall Street Journal expose had struck a devastating blow, but Elizabeth Holmes wasn't ready to surrender. Dressed in her signature black turtleneck, she went on a media offensive, appearing on television and conferences, dismissing the accusations as an attack from powerful forces who wanted to crush innovation. "This is what happens when you try to change the world," she declared with unwavering confidence. But behind the scenes, the walls were closing in. Theranos' biggest partner, Walgreens, had poured $140 million into the company. Now, faced with mounting pressure, they halted their blood testing partnership. Safeway did the same. Investors, once eager to ride the wave of a $9 billion revolution, began distancing themselves, hoping to salvage whatever they could. Then, the government stepped in. The Centers for Medicare and Medicaid Services, CMS, launched an investigation into Theranos' lab practices. What they found was alarming: contaminated machines, faulty testing procedures, and widespread regulatory violations. Patients had been given incorrect results that could have cost them their lives. In July 2016, CMS banned Elizabeth Holmes from operating any lab for 2 years. It was the beginning of the end. Soon, lawsuits flooded in from investors, patients, and former business partners. The SEC, Securities and Exchange Commission, opened an investigation, alleging that Theranos had engaged in massive fraud, misleading investors and the public about its technology. By 2018, the final blow came. Elizabeth Holmes and Ramesh Sunny Balwani were charged with fraud, accused of deceiving investors, patients, and doctors. The Theranos board dissolved. The company, once valued at $9 billion, became worthless. Employees were laid off, offices were shut down, and Elizabeth Holmes, once celebrated as the youngest self-made female billionaire, lost everything. But as she walked out of the Theranos headquarters for the last time, one question remained. Would she finally face the truth? Or would she fight to the bitter end, refusing to accept the reality of what she had done? The courtroom was silent as Elizabeth Holmes stood before the judge, her once unshakable confidence now worn thin. The woman who had commanded Silicon Valley, who had convinced the world that a single drop of blood could change medicine forever, was now facing the consequences of her deception. The U.S. government had built an airtight case. Elizabeth and her former partner, Sunny Balwani, were charged with multiple counts of fraud, accused of knowingly deceiving investors, doctors, and patients for years. Prosecutors presented damning evidence, emails and internal documents showing that Theranos knew its machines didn't work. Witnesses who testified that Holmes personally misled investors and partners. Former patients who had received false and dangerous test results, putting their health at risk. As the trial unfolded, Elizabeth's defense was clear. She denied knowingly committing fraud. She claimed that she had truly believed in Theranos' mission. She even accused Sunny Balwani of emotional and psychological abuse, saying he manipulated her decisions. But the jury wasn't convinced. After months of testimony, deliberation, and media frenzy, the verdict was reached. Guilty. Elizabeth Holmes, once the youngest self-made female billionaire, was convicted of fraud. In a stunning fall from grace, the woman who had been compared to Steve Jobs was now sentenced to prison. Her net worth, once $4.5 billion, was now zero. Theranos was gone. Her empire had crumbled. Her legacy, forever tainted.